Good morning and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, there appears to be no end game in sight as the U.S. abandons peace talks and threatens arms buildup from its new mineral deal. Paul, as always, want to thank you for being a part of the discussion. And you know what? Suddenly things have changed and not for the better in Ukraine.
No, well, first off, thanks for joining today, Ken. Pleasure as ever. No, absolutely not. And the question as well with regards to this is what's going to happen next? That is something we'll come on to shortly. But first, obviously, there was this mineral deal signed between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which the details aren't exactly clear. So therefore, you have to take whatever's said with a bit of a grain of salt. But the implication is there's going to be some 50-50 split in terms of future revenues, or I would assume profits. No indication who's going to invest huge amounts of money in these ventures. And certainly you wouldn't expect it to be the US government. So if it's not the US government, it's private enterprise. Well, how exactly do you get private enterprise to invest in these projects? And then say to them, sorry, we're keeping the profits. It'll end up being a profit split, which means whoever stumps up the money will get 80% or something. And the United States and Ukraine might get 10% each or something. And that's assuming you can get anyone to invest in these projects because there's no guarantee of success, of economic viability, and mining operations cost huge amounts of money. Uh, and also, of course, one of the big problems is in terms of these mining operations is where are they located? Because a lot of potential resources are in Russian controlled territory as far as Ukraine's concerned, and arguably the US as far as Russia's concerned. They're part of the Russian Federation. So Russia's not going to allow Western companies to come in and develop assets they regard as being part of Russia. So this deal is rather meaningless. The only reason it's been signed, and I think it's very obvious, we have to take a step back first and say, well, before Trump was elected, part of his election campaign is I will end the war in 24 hours. Well, he's been in office, what, February, March, basically 100 days. And he's ended nothing. So, and then there was a lot of false dawns. Oh, yes, we're making progress, both sides are reaching some sort of initial agreement. There's not much to be resolved before we get an agreement. All the usual meaningless statements. And here we are, and the US has gone nowhere. And then a couple of weeks ago or so, the US started making noises about, well, if we don't start to see progress, we're going to walk away from this. Well, they decided to walk away from this to all intents and purposes, although they're sort of denying this once they got this mineral deal, because then that's something they can sell to the American people and sell to Congress. Look, we got a deal. We're going to get all our money back in the future, which they're not. They probably won't even get 5% back. But it just sounds good, keeps the MAGA fans happy, keeps the Republicans in check, and keeps the idea, well, we went in there and we struck a deal that's good for America. Well, that remains to be seen, and probably in all likelihood it means nothing. But this is all about face saving because the US has failed to resolve the war in 24 hours, 24 days. And the way it's going, 24 weeks. And therefore, they've done what the Americans do when the going gets really tough and they can't really sell it anymore as a win to whoever, the American people, the Beltway, Congress, whoever. They then do what they always do, like they exited Saigon, when they exited Afghanistan. They want a way out. So what they did is they've gone, well, as far as we're concerned, we've been in receipt of the Ukrainian demands and the Russian demands. So we've done our job as mediators, so we can leave now. We're not needed anymore here. That's just a way of saying we can't do anything. It's too politically embarrassing. We need to get out. Well, let's get out this way and just say to them, well, we haven't exactly stopped being mediators, but we're not mediating anymore. This is just quietly trying to walk away from the problem, go, look, we did everything. We got them together. The fact they wouldn't get together is not our problem. And then we've heard the usual statements. This is not our war. Well, really? I'd like to see how exactly this is not, to a significant extent, the US's war. Everyone knows it is the US's proxy war with Russia, or certainly was with the Biden administration. But they just want this way out. And the problem as well is that makes this even worse is they're still kind of trying to threaten by going, well, if Zelensky doesn't do anything, we're going to stop sending him arms. Well, the problem is part of the deal they've agreed to is with respect to signing this minerals rights issue, is they're now starting to give him military hardware with some minimum figures, 50 million. So what's the maximum? 500 million? 5 billion? We don't know. They're already sending, well, not exactly F-16 planes. They don't fly, but they're sending them from Arizona. They'll be used as parts. So what exactly is the US saying by doing this? We're giving parts so they can get F-16s in the sky again. We're going to give them other military hardware. And then they're back to threatening Russia again by saying, well, if Russia stays intransigent, we're going to give Zelensky more arms than he's ever had since the start of the war. So, I mean, this is ludicrous. And then you hear statements from Zelensky going, we're going to manufacture our own ballistic missiles. We're accelerating the program. And we're going to have our own ballistic missiles soon. And what exactly are they going to do with those ballistic missiles? I mean, you can say it's a bluff call, and it might well be. But in the grand scheme of things, this has turned this whole war, well, special military operation, as it was called, or is called, into a threat of an all-out war now. There is no end game in sight, but I'll park there because that's kind of putting some background, some introduction, and then we'll get into the detail of what is going on, why there is no end game in sight, and why the US has effectively, obviously, abandoned the peace talks by making some spurious claims about, well, we haven't exactly, but we sort of have. And then there's contradictory statements coming out from US officials, and then threatening to give Zelensky a massive arms buildup. No idea, of course, where those weapons are coming from.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting you mentioned about all-out war, because I tweeted or a couple days ago, maybe it was probably a couple days ago, that this potential by the U.S. using arms and providing more arms to Kiev in lieu of support and for the resources, that could potentially make Russia at a certain point, especially if NATO and the European nations feel like, suddenly get more of a backbone, could force Russia to just say, you know what, enough of this. We've done the SMO and we've been patiently holding to certain restrictions because of this. But if you push us too much, then we'll have no choice but to make a declaration of war, which has international repercussions and ramifications. And then all of a sudden, the US and Europe are going to, you want to talk about backtracking, you're going to see them screaming bloody murder, in the media as it is. But more importantly, I think what we're finding is that there's an old adage, politics is all about perception. And I'm going to use a few anecdotes here. Uh, Claiming that inflation is down. Well, inflation is down because the economy is going more into recession. So people are buying less. Consumers are not spending as much. The supply is coming up. When there was the egg shortage, it was all based upon the culling of flocks. Well, ever since that time, we've had 6, 8 months. many of the flocks are starting to build up. Thus, egg prices are coming back. He takes credit for that. Nothing really out of the ordinary he did, just nature took its course. Politics is all about perception. And, more than anything, it's about keeping the people believing a certain narrative, just as we've seen, the narratives of the past administrations and the media pushing whatever, going back to the pandemic and before. And I think that's the important thing we see with Russia is when Russia met with the United States and discussed what their necessities were. Russia laid out this is the reason why this all began in the first place. You all went against your signed Minsk agreement. Europe did the same thing. So we are going to fight until these demands are set. And then once these demands are set, we are totally content to leave things as be. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like the intelligence from either the US or from Europe is smart enough to realize that that's exactly what Russia has stated from the beginning and what their intentions are, and instead are using that perception and narrative to blow this thing completely out of proportion and keep chaos reigning. So, you know, there are no really cooler heads or intelligent heads in the West who want to find a solution to this. And just for the same reasons that the US was stuck in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years, fighting a conflict that had no real reason or purpose except to help jigger an economy out of the doldrums after 2001, it's the same reason why they're continuing proxy wars and saber rattling on the borders of the Baltic states, saber rattling in the South China Sea over Taiwan. There is no real intention to get into anything big, but they want to keep this chaos going for whatever reason, mostly to keep the populations placated.
Yeah, it's true to some extent, but equally, it's also not the case, particularly with the US. The US has wanted out of this war for a long time, but they can't find a way out of it. Trump had a way out of the war by going, "This is not my war." And he cut off arms, he cut off finance, he made all the right noises, and he should have walked away then and said, "We're trying to mediate. Mediation's not going to work. We're not signing any deals. And we'll wait for the war to end. And then we're going to want some war reparations for all the money we spent with regards to Ukraine. But we're going to deal with that once the war's over." That was what he should have done. That was what was the anticipation. But no, because he lost all his political face, now they forced this deal through to try and look like they won something, as I said, with the minerals rights deal. But the United States absolutely doesn't want any war with Russia directly. Europe doesn't. They for the whole 3 years, they kept making high octane comments and then admitted, "We just tried to scare Russia. They can't go to war with Russia or even look like they want to go to war with Russia because it's World War III and Europe will cease to exist in 15 minutes. People don't admit that publicly. Privately, they all know it, but politicians have tried to look tough for 3 years, so they have to keep trying to look tough in the eyes of people. But it's all meaningless, and the fact the US is walking away from this means Europe's now going, well, what's going to happen? The US doesn't want anything to do with this. They're not going to stand there. They're the yapping chihuahuas who cower behind the Rottweiler, or the Rottweiler's clearing out a town and going, "We've had enough of this, so we don't want anything to do with it. We scored some political points. We're going to leave it to the Russians and the Ukrainians to deal with this." And we know that the Russians' stated objectives include demilitarization. Well, the United States is now threatening to remilitarize them, and maybe after the war, militarize them some even more. So that is squarely in a directly contradicts the Russian perspective on this. So is that going to accelerate ending the war? Absolutely not. Russia's position is no NATO membership. Well, America seems to agree with that. They've seemed to agree to for Ukraine to give Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and leave Crimea. But the Ukrainians don't agree with that. Ukraine still wants NATO membership. Ukraine wants to have a big, huge army after the war's ended. So the Americans and the Ukrainians can't reach an agreement on things, and the Russians and the Ukrainians are poles apart. They're in completely different perspectives, and it's not going to change. So if that doesn't change, the Americans can try and sanction Russia all they like and give Ukraine everything. Well, what's left to give them? It's not going to change anything either. This will just means this war will grind on and on and on in perpetuity. And if Ukraine isn't bluffing and does develop ballistic missiles and starts firing them into Russia, well, very quickly there will be a war. And I don't think the problem will be then as to how are we going to have a peace settlement? The risk is that just ends in the complete and utter total capitulation of Ukraine, the end of the war, and Russia will take whatever it wants in the process. So in the end, that's worse for the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian people. But this is what happens when in every situation, every war, anything the United States is involved in, it ends up blowing up in their face. They end up wanting an exit strategy. And in this case, they've scored some political points. So it looks like, we've achieved something, unlike the Biden administration, because it's Biden's war. Well, if they're already arming Ukraine, it's now Trump's war. And they're also providing intelligence. That's Trump's war. Whatever they're doing to aid the Ukrainian side now makes it Trump's war. Whether he wants to pretend to walk away from it and say we're not mediating, but if your military and your intelligence agencies are providing this kind of assistance, they're complicit in the war. The Americans can try and deny it, but it's a statement of facts. So therefore, the question then comes, what's next? What happens? Well, nothing except a continuation of what we're seeing, which is Russia just taking more and more territory. They've kicked them all out completely out of Kursk. They're now building a corridor in Sumy of about 50 square miles or kilometers to keep Ukraine away from the border. They'll keep making progress in Donetsk, in Zaporozhye, in obviously Kherson. And the risk is if it carries on and on, they'll start to take Dnipro and they'll reach the Dnieper River. And who knows what happens then. But this just creates total chaos and uncertainty. And therefore, the Russians, you're going to sit there looking at the Americans going, well, you claimed you're going to act tough and try and help end the war. Well, you clearly aren't, because actually you're not tough and you're not capable of ending the war. So we'll have to end the war. And this is going to be devastating for Ukraine, for Ukrainian people who've suffered enough as it is. And Europe's going to sit there and do nothing, because Europe will never do anything without the Americans. And also, what exactly are they going to do? I mean, there's a lot of misrepresentation of statements. Everything Europe said is, we're going to send forces in at first. Everyone, see, they're joining the war. No, this is after the war's over as peacekeeping forces. And then it's suddenly all the countries went, no, we're not getting involved. Then there was about 3 of them. And then Britain and France went, no, we're not sending forces. We might give some aerial support, but with all vague statements. And all these summits came and went, and everyone's gone quiet. We've heard nothing. Because they don't want to actually get involved. They thought by saying all this, somehow America would jump in first and go, well, we're going to deal with this because we can't allow you to deal with it, Europe. And America goes to Europe, we're not interested, and go and sit down and shut up, because without us, you don't do anything anyway. And they've gone, okay, we're not doing anything. Now, okay, we can't have a crystal ball and know exactly what will pan out in the future, but for over 3 years, nothing has remotely looked like Europe's getting involved. And if they do, as I said, it's World War III. And, the Russians have made their position clear. It's like all these idle threats coming from Ukrainians about having an attack in Red Square on Victory Day, and apparently the Russians came out and said if you do that, it's a nuclear war. I mean, so the Russians are reaching the end of the line with this. And where's the trust with America? They can't sit there and go, well, we can trust you in the future. And because this is the problem, the US just cannot be trusted by anyone anymore, whether it's the trade war, whether it relates to the Ukraine war. But this thing's just turned into a total debacle. And we knew at the end of the day, when two sides are poles apart in their assessment of how the war ends, there's never going to be an agreement. I think the Russians believed that the Americans would put huge pressure on the Ukrainians, and they haven't. And in fact, by signing this deal and giving them arms, that makes Zelensky emboldened again. He now thinks, oh, we can continue the war because we've signed this deal, and America will just keep giving us arms, and we'll say the Russians are intransigent and they'll give us more arms. And to quote, we'll give Zelensky more arms than he's ever had. And he thinks, oh, we can carry on the war, which he can't. And this is just symptomatic of a situation where somebody decides, I know, let's have a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia's going to collapse. We'll get rid of Putin. We'll balkanize Russia. It'll be end of the multipolar world. China will collapse and capitulate. The global South countries will as well. We'll all win, and Ukraine will get to be part of NATO, and we'll push, NATO's borders even further east. And they all thought this. They thought this is a given, and it was never a given. And here we are, and we're just now where chaos reigns. And what happens next is this SMO carries on until Ukraine does something absolutely idiotic, probably. And at some point, the Russians will run out of patience and declare war. And then the West will see what the Russians were capable of, and they will wish they never, ever allowed this conflict to get that far at that point in time, because then that becomes a major geopolitical problem for them. But more importantly, is from their selfish perspective, it starts to hit them hard at home. And a lot of them, their political careers will be finished. And they're only interested in feathering their own nests politically. If they think they're out on the rear, then they're going to start panicking. But by then, it'll be too late. Not, of course, in any way, shape, or form saying, well, what about the Ukrainian people? Don't they matter? Of course, they don't matter. No one cares about them. No one in the West, they're just cannon fodder. As far as the West's concerned, they're just an excuse to keep a war going. But in the end, this is all going to blow up in the face of the West, as it always has done and always will do. And it won't just be history that remembers this. It'll be remembered in the present, and this will have enormous ramifications geopolitically, politically inside countries for NATO, and also ultimately, and sadly, who knows what will happen in Ukraine itself in the fallout of all of this.
In the end, my biggest fear has always been is that when it comes to rhetoric, the intelligent people, I like to use Medvedev as a great example. He understands rhetoric being just that, and not to the point of that's what they're going to do. But the more that Trump and his administration, we talked about this a few days ago, making insults or things, rhetoric that is taken and perceived as a deadly insult, maybe perhaps what was said about Iran, those potential things could lead to something even greater. Regarding Russia and Ukraine, I think there's been so much rhetoric, they understand each other and they know what the end result and consequences are. But at a certain point, I think the West has the potential to bite off more than they can chew. They're going to say the wrong things, and it's going to be perceived incorrectly by the wrong individuals. And you do not know what chaotic mess is going to explode from there. Paul, was there any other ideas or comments you wanted to make regarding this
No, I
topic?
think that's fine. I mean, this is a subject to return to in the future. I mean, you could talk for 3 or 4 hours about it, but people would fall asleep, and that's not what we're here to do. I think that sets the scene for what's going to happen in the future, and at some point when it's appropriate to discuss it again, we'll do so.
Absolutely. Paul, as always, thank you very much for your time and for your insights.
Yes, and likewise.
And everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.